Well, I think we can start if everybody is ready. As president of the IIP, I want to welcome you all, especially, of course, our panelists. Thank you very much for being here. And I want, of course, particularly thank Angela Kane, who is moderating the panel and who is also presenting our guests on the panel. I want to thank again Angela Kane and Hans Gärtner, who for our institute, the IIP, organizing again and again different seminars, talks, webinars on transatlantic relations and on disarmament. And I think that's very important, especially in these days. Now, we all remember, how could we forget, that we had a policy of America first, or America only even. We had a president who was at least neglecting, if not fighting against multilateralism. And I think it is high time, and we are all ready for going back to multilateralism, which does not mean that we're going back to all the same policies of the past, but multilateralism can be revitalized and must be revitalized. And if President Biden was supposed to say he wants to reinforce US leadership on arms control and non-proliferation, so that I think is for many of us a good signal. Now, many of us in Europe at least are critical when again and again US says we want to be the leader and we have the leadership. But on arms control and non-proliferation to have leadership, I think is a very good attitude and a very good policy. And of course, primarily it's about the US and Russia because they have the lion's share on nukes or on many of the high sophisticated weapons. But China will come in also in the debate, maybe is another thing, but this is the concentration. And my final remark, we see more and more, and also now with the case of Navalny, that we have a very tense relationship between Russia on the one side and the West, if it is European Union or if it's the United States. I think in this time to have a dialogue, to have a talk, to have hopefully an agreement between Russia and the US is very important. We are very unhappy about what happens now in Russia concerning Navalny, but it's only one element of it. Many other developments we see with great concerns. But I think all these calls for sanctions and to stop the dialogue and the discussion, and you cannot discuss issues with Russia, with President Putin, this doesn't lead to any fruitful future for us at least. And therefore at IIP we are quite interested in a dialogue across the borders, in going back to multilateralism. And even if we have big differences on many of the issues, there must be some issues, and armament and disarmament is one of them, where we have to come to an agreement. So that's just the motivation we have at the IIP in Vienna. And that's just my welcoming word again. I look forward to a very interesting discussion, and hand over to Angela Kane, our Vice President and former Deputy General Secretary of the United Nations, responsible for disarmament. Angela, please. It's up to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Hannes. Thank you for this introduction also. I think when we look at the world around, we know there are a lot of problems. So the extension of a New START for another 5 years actually was the good news. So it was something that happened very quickly after the new President Biden came into office. And we wanted to see if we could discuss it in terms of what does it mean? Is it business as usual? Do we engage in new initiatives and negotiations? What is possible? You know, where does everyone stand? And we have really three excellent panelists here, and I'm very grateful to all three of them who have come. We have, and I go in alphabetical order, I have Tom Countryman, and I just learned one forgets not living anymore in the United States. It's a holiday today, so we thank you for being here, and it's President's Day, very appropriately. Thank you for being here. And he, of course, is the chairman of the Arms Control, of the board of the Arms Control Association, and that is an international NGO which analyzes key security issues and advises the executive branch, Congress, and the public just to promote global security. It's disarmament, but it's also some more global issues. And he retired from the Foreign Service 3-4 years ago, and was, I think, 35 years in the service. And at the time, he served simultaneously as acting Undersecretary General for Arms Control and as Assistant Secretary for International Security and Non-Proliferation. So a very high-level post, and I know that he has vast experience in this area. The second speaker will be Anton KHLOPKOV, who is the director of the Center for Energy and Security Studies, CNES, and chairman of the Moscow Non-Proliferation Conference, always a very well-attended, a very substantive conference that is held every 2 years. He is also a member of the advisory board of the Security Council of the Russian Federation and a member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Studies. And lastly, but not least at all, is GAUKHAR MUKHATZHANOVA. She's the director of the International Organizations and Non-Proliferation Program at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And she works primarily on multilateral regimes and institutions in nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. And we always call her the absolute institution on anything that has to do with non-proliferation, and particularly the NPT. But I always look forward to hearing her views. So those are our three speakers. You know, this event is live streamed, so it is on the record. And we have asked the three speakers to each speak about 12 to 15 minutes. We had posed some framing questions if they wanted to address them. But of course, we look forward to hearing their views. And with those few words, I look forward to starting Tom Countryman. If you have questions already from the audience that are coming up as our speakers are talking, then please put them in the Q&A. I'll try to monitor as best as I can. But it's now my great pleasure to hand it over to Tom Countryman, please.
Thank you very much, Angela. And thank you for remembering that today is President's Day in the United States, although when you're retired, every day is a holiday. So it's not so different for me. First, I want to, of course, welcome the fact that President Putin and President Biden moved rapidly to extend the New START treaty. It has been perhaps the #1 issue for organizations like the Arms Control Association and so many others for the last 4 years to get this necessary piece of work done with no fuss and no delay. And I'm very glad that the Biden administration did exactly that, take a business-like approach to extension. The Trump administration ignored the question for 3 years and then put some amateurs in charge of trying to negotiate with the Russian Federation, including, well, their basic mistakes were first assuming that Moscow needed this agreement more than Washington did, which I think no objective observer agrees with. It is important for both countries, national security, for their defense budgets, and in every other way, and gave no advantage to either state by its extension. And secondly, I think for the Trump administration, it was much more about public relations than about serious negotiations. The negotiations were few and far between, and were each accompanied by lots of tweeting and public statements, regardless of the actual substance of the discussion. This kind of negotiation does not increase pressure on the other party to come to an agreement. It's simply putting a gun to your own head in the negotiation process. And in this way, sadly, it reminds me of what we see happening with the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, right now, with each side doing more public statements than private negotiation and boxing themselves in, putting pressure on themselves. So it is a good start. It is kind of the minimum to keep the strategic stability situation in the world at a manageable level and to begin to rebuild the arms control and non-proliferation architecture that has served well every country in the world. As we move forward, I know that, Angela, you wanted us to focus on multilateral aspects. My main message is that right now, the task is not multilateral. The primary task rests in Moscow and Washington. It remains the fact that the most dangerous threat the world faces to human existence, seriously, with the bilateral security situation and the fact that they still hold 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal. So I will talk a little bit about multilateralism, what the world needs to do, what it ultimately must do, and in the shorter term, what it can do to support a more rational negotiation and policy approach by the United States and the Russian Federation. So what should be in those discussions? I'll do a little bit less about the substance of the negotiation and a little bit more about the form, the structure, the method of engagement between Washington and Moscow. First, with apologies, the US is not quite ready to start. Our nomination and confirmation process takes some time. I'm hopeful that all of the key officials in the arms control and non-proliferation area will be in place in the Biden administration within a month, 2 months, 3 months, but please, I'm not making a specific prediction. Once they are in place, what is necessary are frequent private consultations between Washington and Moscow in this field. We have to get away from assuming that one meeting every 6 months for 2 hours in Helsinki or Vienna is sufficient to make progress. It's necessary for these meetings, whatever the ultimate level of the meetings, become boring to the outside world. They become so routine that there is not a pressure for tweets, that there are not any breathless speculations by journalists about whether or not there has been a breakthrough. Rather, they have to be systematic and frequent. I would hope at least every month for more than a few hours for a day or two. And I note that this is not quite the same thing as business as usual. We can't minimize the separation on political issues and strategic issues between Washington and Moscow at this point. But there is broad support not only within the Biden administration, but within the Congress for engaging on issues of national security that matter to both sides. And that certainly includes arms control and strategic stability. The substantive agenda, I would hope, does not become a stumbling block to starting talks. And this is what I have seen in the past repeatedly in the Obama administration, and that simply agreeing on what topics were on the table prevented the initiation of a serious dialogue. With the US reluctant to talk about ballistic missile defense and the Russian side reluctant to start unless that was in the agenda, we really never got started from 2013 forward. The topics today, I think, are familiar to all of us. Delivery vehicles and the number of delivery vehicles are what Washington and Moscow have negotiated for many years. And even if they're not always comfortable talking about it, they know how to do it. And they can make further progress on limiting delivery vehicles. The one new idea from the Trump administration was a freeze and ultimately a reduction in the total number of warheads. This is more difficult to do, but it is possible for the two sides to discuss it, to make perhaps first political commitments about a freeze as the Trump administration discussed with Moscow, and to see what is possible in this field. The Russian side has made clear ballistic missile defense must be on the table, and I think it is unavoidable that it has to be on the table if there are going to be serious discussion. Other topics are harder because they are still newer. We have not talked about limitations on space and on cyber within the context of a strategic stability discussion before. And it would be very hard to make deals that cut across these different categories, but they have to be discussed. And then finally, are there possibilities for the kinds of agreements that we have always made too late in the past? Can we put restrictions, for example, on the number or the type of hypersonic delivery vehicles before Beijing and Washington and Moscow have each built several hundred of them? The other point about the US-Russian negotiation has to do with the form of agreements. There are good reasons that Moscow has always preferred to see legally binding treaties. There are big reasons in Washington why getting a treaty through the US Congress is difficult today and will remain difficult for some time. This is not to say we give up on treaties when we get to the right agreement, but it does say that we can make other forms of agreement, whether politically binding or whether simply declarations of practice and of intent, that have the effect of demonstrating progress, of building confidence, and of leading to still stronger agreements. Just a word, a very one-sided perspective on the history of arms control. Arms control between Moscow and Washington has always moved spasmodically in fits and starts. We have had long periods of time in which the old security military think has dominated both sides' approach to the issue. We've had many times where the two sides have simply not been in sync at the same time. One of my favorite quotes is from my colleague Edward Ift, talking after SALT I. He said, "Moscow and Washington negotiations are so difficult, not because the sides have different positions, but because the sides have the same position, only never at the same time." We need to look for an opportunity to have the two sides get to the same position at the same time. The history of arms control is also marked by innovation, by breakthroughs, by creative thinking. Reagan and Gorbachev may have been unlikely visionaries, but the fact is that they had a vision of a less dangerous world and practically put that into concrete agreements. It is perhaps harder today to expect the same kind of vision from the leaders that we have today, but there is an opportunity if the two governments are prepared to send to discussions people who have that kind of vision, people who can ask the kind of questions such as, can we imagine a world in which neither side needs more than 1,000 nuclear weapons? And if so, what are the steps to get towards that world? In other words, it is, instead of negotiating from where we are in a positive direction, it is imagining where we would like to be and taking the steps that bring us closer to that world. Not a global zero world at first, but a world that is less dangerous. And what are the steps that we take today to get us there? I'll have some more comments perhaps in the Q&A about what the rest of the world can do to support this. There is a role for the P5. There is a role for NATO and Europe in helping the United States and the Russian Federation to recognize that what they are discussing is not only their own security, but what happens on the battlefield, which is, by the way, Europe. more than it is Russia or the United States. There's a role for supporters of the ban treaty, the TPNW. They need to recognize that there's been some progress and encourage it. They also need to recognize that nuclear weapons still matter to countries that believe they face security threats. And if nuclear weapons are not the answer to those security threats, what are other states doing to provide less dangerous answers to those security threats? And all of us across the world have a responsibility to reinforce the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to be honest, unsparing, but objective in criticism of the nuclear weapon states for their failure to move faster on disarmament, but to be just as resolute in opposing anyone who seeks to weaken the non-proliferation pillar of the NPT. Many other ideas for what we need to do multilaterally, how to bring other nuclear weapon states into negotiation, but I want to finish where I began, the obligation. And I wish it was felt as a moral obligation instead of only practical obligation, is upon Washington and Moscow to have a more serious discussion of risk reduction in global stability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was really excellent. And I particularly liked your focus also on sort of saying this has to be a sustained effort. It has to be talks. It has to be under the radar, so to say, not these big meetings twice a year, possibly. And let's not forget that it's been 10 years since Moscow and Washington have negotiated. So that's a long time, also maybe for a new generation of negotiators and talkers to come up in their career. And I also thank you for putting together some of the ideas in terms of what could be talked about, what is important to talk about, what is in on the table, etc. So I think this is really important to also create confidence and not sort of saying, you know, where is it where we are, but rather what is the vision of what we want to be. So thank you very much for that. And I now turn over to Anton KHLOPKOV. Anton, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you for inviting me. First and foremost, I think that a full-year extension of the treaty provides additional time to restore the regular and structured Russia's-US dialogue on arms control, about which Tom Countryman just spoke, but I think broader also to develop new mechanism for arms control and disarmament. In my remarks, I would like to focus not only on Russia-US potential negotiations, which are critically important, but also what other venues could be used to restore the arms control as we know it for many years. First of all, we should remind ourselves that the new administration in Washington is in the office only for less than 4 full weeks, and it is too premature to conclude what would be the long-term implications of the New START extension. But it goes without saying that after about 25 days in the office, Biden administration achieved more in arms control than the previous US administration during the 4 years in the office. And I very much agree with Tom that it is necessary to have a regular and well-structured dialogue between Russia and the United States. And I will share some of my ideas, what could be the formats and the forums for such a dialogue, but I first would like to mention that while Biden administration is deserved credit for accepting Russia's proposal from December 2019 to extend the New START treaty with no precondition, a lot has to be done to restore US reputation as reliable diplomatic and treaty partner. Again, I think it's very unfortunate where we are, and I do agree with Mr. Svoboda, who said that we do need the United States as an active player in arms control and non-proliferation, US as a depository of NPT, and as Tom mentioned, Russia and US jointly control about 90% of the global nuclear arsenal, and this is exactly why it is important to have more attention to arms control in Washington than it was during the recent years. And I think if we speak about reputation, the GCPOA, which Tom already mentioned, and Open Sky Treaty would be the test cases for the another test cases for the new administration. I hope that in both cases, US will be in position to return to those agreements, though it is not clear whether the Biden administration will be able to achieve that. And of course, another important issue is CTBT. We should not forget about that. I understand the domestic situation in the States. There is no enough votes in the Senate nowadays, but my personal hope that this administration will adopt more active policy with regard CTBT and start work actively with Senate, as well as US think tankers will be more active on this particular topic than they were in the past. Now back to future of arms control and disarmament. I think it should be a combination of bilateral approaches on which Tom already spoke, and multilateral. And Russian US dialogue on strategic stability that covers all related issues should be resumed. And what is key, and again, I'm glad that we are on the same page with Tom on this, it should be a regular one and well structured. And a regular one does not mean to meet twice a year for a few hours, as Tom already referred to that. We do have good past examples when delegations from two capitals work together on quite a regular basis. It does not mean if this regularity is achieved that two countries will be in position to achieve easily a breakthrough, but with no regular dialogue, there is no chance to achieve new progress. And again, it goes without saying that with new US administration, many problems, many disagreements between our countries will stay with us. But I think it would be smart, it would be wise if our countries will be able to compartmentalize arms control and non-proliferation, cooperation, strategic stability dialogue from other non-related issues. We do have many questions to each other, but I think it would be useful if our countries will be able to separate the core issues which are critically important for our dialogue on arms control, strategic stability, and broader non-proliferation. As, by the way, we did during the GCPOA negotiations in 2013, 2014, and 2015, when, despite of many disagreements on regional issues, our two countries were able to work closely to achieve the deal which we know today as GCPOA. And of course, it's not only about political will. And my hope that we do have this will in Moscow and Washington today. At least there are signs that there is such a will in new US administration, and New START extension is a good evidence of that. But personalities and the chemistry between the delegations and key negotiators are critically important. So again, I personally very much looking forward to knowing who will be the next US Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control Verification and Compliance, because my understanding it will be a key figure in the State Department who will run arms control related portfolio. And in addition to intensifying discussions and dialogue between diplomats, of course, it is necessary to initiate regular dialogue between militaries, between senior officials from Department of Defense, US Department of Defense, and Russian Ministry of Defense. Next, as I already said, if we speak about the future of arms control and disarmament, I do believe that it should be a combination of bilateral and multilateral approaches. And here I would like to move to P5 format, which again already been mentioned by Tom. And there are different assessments how efficient this dialogue is. There is a lot of criticism how much this dialogue is action oriented. Of course, there are a lot of jokes and irony with regard the glossary which was produced by the P5. But I should say at this point we don't have a better venue to bring together P5 countries to discuss arms control and disarmament related issues. And I think we should be focused how to make this dialogue more efficient. What kind of topics could be included to the future agenda of this format. But I do believe that if we speak about different layers, different components of the future arms control and disarmament, P5 dialogue, probably strengthened P5 dialogue, should play an important role. And as a first step in that direction, to strengthen the dialogue, I think ahead or before the 10th NPT review conference, P5 states could reaffirm the principle articulated in the Gorbachev-Reagan statement that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. I think it will help not only to the NPT conference itself, but it will also signal to other countries that P5 format could be strengthened and could be more efficient. And of course, the next question, and I'm not sure that I have an answer to that question, how to bring to the discussion, how to bring to the dialogue nuclear possessing states which are not members of the NPT, or just to avoid any misreading of what I said and what countries should be included to this discussion, I would phrase that in a different way. How nuclear possessing states which have never been a party to the NPT could be engaged interrelated dialogue. Again, as I mentioned, I'm not sure that I have a good answer, but I do believe it would be useful if appropriate platform, appropriate mechanism for such a dialogue will be found. And I would like to refer to the idea which was on different occasions introduced by Indian scholars, by prominent Indian scholars. They introduced the idea of the nuclear risk reduction summit, which could bring together new P5 countries and other nuclear possessing states. Again, I do believe that this idea deserves to be considered in depth, though of course there are many questions and there are many ifs. Whether such a summit could generate positive outcome, or it could create some new dividing lines. And probably the very final point I have in my introductory remarks, that non-nuclear weapon states should think what would be their future role in arms control, in disarmament, in accordance with their obligations under NPT. Because I do agree that Russia and US, as major possessors of the nuclear weapon, should have special responsibility. There are other P5 countries, there are nuclear possessing states which are out of NPT, but I do believe that non-nuclear weapon states, especially allied with P5 countries, or countries which have nuclear weapon on their territory, should play their own role as part of the future arms control and disarmament process. Yeah, probably I'll stop here and will be pleased to share other thoughts during Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anton. I must tell you, the questions are already coming in, but thank you for reminding us that President Biden has only been in office less than a month. We forget that sometimes because it's gone so fast. And I think we've all looked forward to what was happening. But of course, he has a lot on his plate. And I appreciate, as Tom also mentioned, in terms of treaties are very hard to accept, to get through Congress and the Senate in the United States. So you, Anton, you also mentioned that there are other ways of doing it, agreements, dialogue, structure, and it doesn't always have to be a treaty, but how important it is that there's a regular and structured dialogue that is going on and that is being resumed after so many years, including the dialogue between the militaries, which I think is very, very true. And also, I appreciate that you mentioned the CTBT, which has been this unresolved issue with the entry into force, in particular with the ratification in the United States, as well as other countries like China. But on the other hand, there are a lot of issues that are on the table. I think we cannot, as you mentioned them, and as Tom as well mentioned, cannot tackle them all at the same time. We have to look at what are the core issues, but also where's the vision where we want to end up, rather than really sort of saying we want everything, because everything is not going to be possible. But these were, two excellent presentations. And we now have the speaker, that is GAUKHAR MUKHATZHANOVA, and she will now be the final panelist, and then we'll turn to the Q&As or to additional comments if you wish to make them. Thank you. GAUKHAR, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Angela, and thank you to the the Institute of Peace for inviting me, and the other speakers for doing most of the work already in terms of covering the issues. Now, Angela, you posed a number of framing questions to us before the session, and so I will diligently try to go one by one, though I don't promise to cover all of them. And you started by asking if extending New START was really the right move, considering some of the criticism that was leveled against the treaty in terms of it not covering the short-range systems, for example. And the answer is a very short answer would be yes. It was most certainly the right move to extend New START for the full 5 years, because letting the last treaty standing between the United States and Russia to expire in the environment of already very acrimonious and still worsening relations between Russia and the United States and West more broadly would have been really destabilizing. It could have opened the door to a full-on arms race that we haven't seen in some decades. And having no treaty-based caps would have ended the predictability that the treaty gave about the US and Russian strategic arsenals, would have negatively affected transparency, with neither side under any legally binding obligation to report on the numbers of their strategic delivery systems and warheads. And I think in terms of Russia, that was particularly important because, unlike the United States, it doesn't have this history of unilateral disclosures of its arsenal. So beyond even just the bilateral relationship, I think there certainly are larger benefits to extending the treaty. And the criticism from the previous US administration that the treaty does not cover short-range nuclear weapons was, of course, entirely beside the point. It's kind of like coming into a vegetarian restaurant complaining there's no pork on the menu, which was also entirely on brand for the previous administration, because every treaty that wasn't negotiated by them was flawed, and some of the officials never really have seen a treaty they liked. But more importantly, on the substance, the treaty by design is about strategic systems. And it's important to remember that from the beginning, it was really meant to ensure predictability and transparency and stability, to buy time for the next negotiations, to negotiate the next potentially more ambitious agreement. Now, unfortunately, US and Russia were not able to open a new chapter in arms control, not in any positive sense, at least in this time. But it wasn't due to any kind of flaw in the New START itself, but rather because of the changing relationship and circumstances, in some case due to domestic politics in both countries, and substantive disagreements on compliance with other treaties and the future controls that have to be negotiated. So all that really shaped the outcome where we arrived at the end of the New START's initial term with nothing to replace it. So it was very important to buy more time to continue with arms control. The next question is whether it was necessary to extend by 5 years, or could the US have asked for a shorter extension? Did the US have a chance to gain some kind of negotiating leverage that way for the next stage of arms control negotiations? And the previous US administration, of course, did talk about a shorter extension, and those same officials who say that Russia was desperate to extend the treaty presumably already had that leverage, right, to conclude a short extension. Unfortunately, nothing came of it. So Russia did agree in principle, if you remember last fall, to a 1-year extension in the freeze on all warheads, which I wouldn't necessarily say was a sign of desperation. I think Russia was very anxious to extend New START, but they were also hedging their bets a little bit because things got really, really late in the game, and they wanted to make sure that they have some kind of extension before the next US administration comes in, having probably calculated that Trump is more likely to lose the election. So the Trump administration had a year or more to formulate what they would actually like to achieve with the shorter extension, right? What they would like to negotiate in a year's time. But there was no clarity on what the vision was. There was a great deal of talking about China, importance of involving China, but that also didn't lead anywhere. The Biden administration, however, came in with absolutely no time to waffle about. They really needed to make a decision very quickly. And having inherited a huge mess on all fronts, domestic and foreign, they really had to set priorities. And playing games with shorter extension and potentially gaining leverage that way was, I think, would have been an unproductive use of time and would have created conditions for future instability. So I think they made the right call that there's no need to set up yourself and the rest of the world for a crisis in a year or two. And all the more so, it's important given that in the context of still ongoing pandemic, existing serious disagreements on variety of issues between the US and Russia, we're really not likely to see very much progress in the follow-on arms control talks in at least the next year. And I'm being optimistic. So it's really going to take a lot of time to get back to the negotiations, to the negotiation mode. So in that sense, I think absolutely 5-year full extension was the right way to go. You may also want to keep in mind the sort of election cycles in the United States. Effectively, US and Russia have the next 3 years probably to work seriously on substance, because concluding an agreement and getting it ratified in the last year of any given president's term is very, very difficult, if at all possible. So having the treaty expire in the 3rd or 4th year of president's term is also not an effective way to use the time that you have. Now, I've mentioned China and Trump's administration desire to have it involved. Presumably, that was one of the problems that the previous US administration had with New START and arms control in general, that it didn't involve China in any way. And it's been argued by the administration and observers and experts that China, with its currently expanding nuclear and other capabilities, is a growing threat to the United States, which in and of itself is not wrong, of course, but is also neither here nor there in terms of actual arms control negotiations. Right. And so, again, having announced that we need to involve China, the previous administration did not give any clear explanation or vision of what it actually means, what would involving China in arms control mean in practical terms. Any mention of China joining New START, I think, wasn't a very serious proposition. I think there was zero chance of China ever joining New START or New START extension talks. It made no sense in terms of what treaty addresses, what it controls, how it defines the systems it controls, the numeric limitations under the treaty. So I think that was a wasted opportunity. For a year we were hearing from the US administration, oh yeah, we're conceptualizing how to what we want from involving China in arms control, and that vision never really came. Now, simply adding China or any other nuclear weapons possessor to the already existing and established bilateral arms control format between the United States and Russia is not going to work. But it would be useful to involve China in arms control dialogue in some fashion. If Biden administration is serious about doing that, they would probably need to start by talking to China. Not talking at China and telling China that it has to get involved, but actually, approaching, getting back to basics of talking to people, to understand what China might be interested in, and where those interests intersect with interests of the United States. And I'm not a China specialist, but issues that come to mind when you start thinking about it is, ballistic missile defense, and that's at the very ambitious end of the spectrum. It's space capabilities, it's cyber, it's hypersonics. And of course, those discussions won't lead straight to treaty negotiations. Those are very new things. And again, US and China don't have that history of arms control negotiations. But the conversation needs to begin. And it might be also an entry point to have trilateral conversations about at least, for example, space and hypersonic capability. But in the most immediate future, and here I agree with previous speakers, bilateral US-Russian arms control negotiations will remain a priority because of the sizes of arsenals, because of the diversity of the systems they have. And here the two sides need time to get back to what Tom described as sort of this boring routine of talks and meetings, which is how serious negotiations have always been done. And as the first steps, they will need to clarify what can actually be on the table in terms of negotiating the next agreement. Are we talking about sort of the repeating some of the old, or adding things? Are some issues ripe for actual negotiation of a legally binding agreement, or some of the new issues that they're willing to add to the table can be or will have to be dealt in a different format? It won't be a bilateral treaty necessarily. It won't be a strict numeric limitation. It will be something else. The idea behind New START a decade or so ago was to buy time and in the meantime have at least one more sort of classic bilateral treaty to get the numbers of deployed strategic systems down, and then broaden the scope, right? And then maybe look at all weapons, not just strategic, but also tactical. Do we have that kind of time now? I'm afraid we've run out of it. The fact that in 10 years we weren't able to negotiate that next kind of standard treaty before moving on to broader context, broader scope, might have meant that we ran down the clock a little bit. And so US and Russia might have to already start looking at all the other systems, and that already came up in the previous statements. And here missile defense remains an intractable issue, unfortunately, but it is a key interest for Russia. So there's probably no avoiding it in the upcoming talks. Plus, there are all the technological advances in other non-nuclear systems, like conventional long-range systems, that also affect how the two sides view strategic stability. So rather than just looking at nuclear strategic systems as we always have, they will have to probably just look at the broader concept. What do we think shapes strategic stability? And it might not be only strategic nuclear weapons. And that, of course, poses additional serious challenges and prompts the need to review the existing format and explore ways to approach the issue of strategic stability more holistically. We don't have a recipe for how to include conventional, non-conventional systems in the same kind of treaty. It may not be one single treaty. Again, you would have to maybe look at some framework situations, some things that can be addressed in a legally binding treaty, some things that would have to take more slowly in terms of the dialogue. And there we might have sort of an entry point for other nuclear weapon states. Because, as I said before, we can't just add them or request that they add themselves to the existing bilateral format and simply do 2 + 1 + 1. And so far, nuclear weapon states, other than US and Russia, have shown very little, if any, interest in arms control negotiations, and appeals to their NPT obligations haven't really been productive in that regard either. But if the talks are not just about this particular nuclear weapon system, but broader about what goes into strategic stability, then you might have an entry point for a dialogue with more participants. Again, not necessarily leading straight to treaty negotiations, but you have to start somewhere. And the P5 process seems like a logical place to begin, though unfortunately it hasn't been very efficient and very effective at addressing the issues that it has had on its agenda. It might make sense to review that format and sort of go back to basics, because it started off with a fairly narrow focus of looking at verification and transparency. Maybe putting fewer issues on the table is a better way to get results in the P5 process than including all the NPT issues and then adding on. So we have interesting times ahead of us. There's really no escaping that. And one issue that I want to also mention, and I'm glad that Tom also brought it up, is the potential impact of the fact that there's a new treaty. We have a new treaty in the regime, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And the fact that it's now part of international law, I think, won't have an immediate impact in terms of forcing anybody to disarm, but it will have bigger normative impact over time, and that might add a bit more urgency and pressure on all of the nuclear weapon states to actually demonstrate progress. They're not ready to join the ban treaty, that's fine, but they have to find a way to demonstrate that they are committed to the goal that they have under the NPT and subsequent review conference decisions. And one way to do it is to actually engage in serious arms control discussions and negotiations. So I'll leave it there, and happy to answer
Thank you very much,
questions.
Gaukhar. That was really excellent. And thank you also for ending on that note about how do we take into account the new treaty, the TPNW, because we've heard a lot about it from the P5 in particular. And there have been many calls, not only for reiterating the Gorbachev-Reagan statement, but also to have a more conciliatory attitude towards the supporters of the member states parties to the TPNW. Also, I like the fact that you reminded us about the election cycle. I think that's a very important consideration because we're looking ahead at like a 5-year now extension of New START. But on the other hand, there will be changes due to the elections, or there probably will be changes due to the elections. So that's another consideration that's really important. I also must underline that it's really important that we always look at things in silos, nuclear in one silo, conventional in another silo, and maybe it's time to sort of think a little bit out of the box and see how we deal with this. But one of the aspects that you have mentioned is also how do we talk to China and how can we engage China? And all three of you have addressed that. And I think maybe there are areas of equality and strategic capability that would be interesting for China, irrespective of the disparity in the numbers of the nuclear weapons. So there's a lot on our plate. There's a lot to be thought about. And before I go to the Q&As, I have one question because it was prompted really by Anton talking about the Indian scholars' proposal about the nuclear risk reduction that you mentioned, Anton. And I was wondering, no one speaks about the nuclear security summits anymore, which was, of course, an initiative by the US. And I know Russia did not attend the last one that was taking place. But on the other hand, it was an effort to go beyond the nuclear weapon states, but also to open up the envelope in terms of the nuclear risk and the nuclear materials. I mean, is this a possibility that one could think about something that's like that? Maybe I could throw this out to you before we go to the Q&As.
Thank you, Angela. First, as I understand, this concept, this idea is not yet well developed. So at least what I've seen from Indian colleagues, so they introduced the idea, but my reading of what they propose, so they would like to bring, first of all, nuclear possessing states and focus not so much on nuclear security as it was during the nuclear security summit cycles, but to start the dialogue on arms control and disarmament between all nuclear possessing states, probably with not expecting too much at the initial stage. So again, my understanding that their proposal was not so much on nuclear security, but on nuclear risk reduction. But again, there are many questions with regard to this concept, and it still has to be better developed by those who introduce and propose that.
Thank you, Anton. Okay, then let me go to the Q&As. And let me go to the first one, which came in from Fred Tanner, I think a good colleague of ours. And he asked, would the proposal of freeze and reduction of warheads be only for strategic or also for sub-strategic warheads? Tom.
Let me give that a short answer and then do a couple of other comments. A freeze, as discussed by the Trump administration with Moscow, would at least be a declaration of no further production or increase in arsenal of both strategic and non-strategic nuclear weapons. To make it a binding treaty with verification would require resolving some technical problems that can be resolved. Not easy, but they can be resolved. So that would be the idea of a freeze. Let me comment on just a couple of other things. I'm also very interested in the idea of some form of nuclear risk reduction summit. I like the format of the nuclear security summits because it avoided the paralysis that inevitably obtains in Geneva or New York or somewhere else. There is no absolute reason that it has to be either the US president or the Russian president who initiates such an effort. In fact, in the nuclear field in particular, I would have more confidence in an initiative that came from India or China or the United Kingdom than I would for one that came from Paris or Washington or Moscow. And the goals, and this is not the first time the idea has been out there, but the goals would be to actually set a future objective and then to obtain commitments from countries that they will not act in ways, they will not take steps that make it harder to reach that objective of a more secure world and ultimately a nuclear weapon-free world. If you go back to this wonderful book, and I know a couple of the authors of the book are on the call now, like Pavel, the idea of Schultz, Kissinger, Perry, and Nunn was that we not take any steps that will make it harder to get to a nuclear weapons-free world. And a summit organized with that explicit purpose would be a good idea and an appropriate role for a country that wants to claim to be a global leader, whether it's India or China or possibly someone else. So I like the idea, and I hope that there is a national leader somewhere courageous enough to take that step.
Okay, let me go to the next question. And in fact, it does come from Pavel Podvik. And he asks, the challenges of future negotiations are well known, from missile defense to space and other issues, many of which are linked, which all of you have spoken of as well. There is, however, one issue that seems to be what he calls self-contained and can be considered separately. And that's a moratorium on INF missiles in Europe, suggested by Moscow. And he adds, with 9 M729 included. What is your take on the chances the US and Russia will start practical discussions of this proposal? So I throw it open to all of you, either one of you. GAUKHAR, you unmuting?
Yes, not that I'm a specialist on this, but I would disagree a little bit that it's a self-contained issue. I think the dances around INF and the notorious missile and the associated problem with accepting the proposed moratorium is all linked to a deeper crisis in trust between the two parties. And the question now is whether the new administration with other people in the Arms Control Bureau in the United States in particular would be willing to re-engage on the subject of what actually happened under the INF, and whether and that would then lead to more clarity as to whether we can accept the moratorium on that was proposed by Russia. But I think it's not, unfortunately, it's not a purely technical self-contained issue anymore. I think it's linked to sort of deeper mistrust and the idea that one side is simply blaming and looking for excuses to get out of treaties, and the other side is just a sort of systemic cheater on the treaties. And on the previous question about nuclear risk reduction summit, in principle, it's an attractive idea. The difficulty compared, I think, to to a nuclear security summit is that the question of nuclear risk reduction is a lot more nebulous than the nuclear security question was back when the summit started. You sort of understood these are the materials we're dealing with. There are certain security measures that have to be taken. There are programs like repatriation of HEU, etc. Nuclear risk reduction will have to start with finding some kind of common understanding amongst the nuclear weapons possessors about what they consider to be risk, what they consider to be destabilizing or stabilizing policies. And so far, the P5 process has had some problems with arriving to any kind of unified understanding on the matter, which is not to say that it's not worth pursuing. It absolutely is worth pursuing, but you might need to start with more focused sort of expert discussions before you have a high level summit to which any country can bring concrete pledges.
Thank you, GAUKHAR. Anyone else? Yeah, Anton, please.
Yeah, on Pavel's question, well, I hope it could be considered separately from other issues. This proposal is on the table, and I'm not sure that I'm in position to speculate what would be the Biden administration policy with regard to this proposal. But I hope that it will be considered in depth, and as some of the former senior U.S. official recently proposed. I was glad recently to hear a number of comments from former senior U.S. officials, including those who were actively involved in related negotiations in the past, that this initiative, this proposal is worth to discuss in depth. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Anton. Yeah, Tom. Yeah.
On INF, there's a lot that I missed not being in government the last 4 years. I never heard a Russian explanation why a new offensive weapon targeted on Western Europe was necessary. I never heard the Europeans who now had additional weapons targeted on them ask the Russians why the hell it was necessary. And I was extremely disappointed that the U.S. response to the new weapon was to withdraw from the INF without a plan to restabilize and provide a less dangerous situation in Europe. So I think all sides have to take some blame here. Europe and NATO states, but not only NATO states in particular, should be taking the lead in pushing the US and the Russian Federation, which are not targeted by these new weapons, to work on a solution that avoids a repetition of the 1980s Euro missile race. President Putin's suggestion in this regard are not in themselves an immediately acceptable package, but they are certainly a basis for negotiation. In terms of when to do it, the priorities for the Biden administration, still in formation at the moment, are first JCPOA, second figuring out how to get back to open skies, and third, I hope, the INF. Some substitute, if not a treaty, a political deal that avoids new threats to either Western Europe or the Russian Federation. Those are three steps that can be separated from the broader strategic stability talks, but if all of them are taken, will provide a much firmer foundation and better atmosphere for those discussions.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you also for bringing in the additional issues that are on the table, so to say, the INF and the open skies, etc. So this is really important, what we're talking about. Now, I have a lot of questions, and I'm going to ask you two of them. And the first comes from Maria Ceporina, and she's asking you, Tom, actually, what is the role of the P5 and the EU in supporting the next steps in post-START arms control? And then to everyone is, how can the next generation support and promote further nuclear risk reduction measures? And the next question, let me take that also, is which role can civil society, like the physicians, play in boosting the US-Russian Federation talks on arms control and nuclear disarmament of Article 6 NPT? And this comes from Peter Buys, the chair of a Dutch affiliate, IPPNW. So let me throw this open to you.
Well, very, very briefly, the role of the P5 in supporting U.S.-Russian negotiations is to be supportive. That means two things. Number one, it means continuing the process of socialization, or if you like, acculturation, into arms control universe. One of the important things that's been done in the P5 process in the last 10 years, even if it has few visible results yet, is to introduce, particularly for the Chinese, the concepts of transparency, verification, declarations that the US and Russia have long embraced, and that will be necessary in the future. Secondly, the P5, even as I say that the US and Russia have to move now, the P5 are not immune from criticism from the rest of the world on their Article 6 obligations, and they cannot simply enjoy a free ride in terms of expanding arsenal or not moderating rhetoric. They need to be in the focus of the rest of the world almost as much as Moscow and Washington need to be. The EU can be supportive, but I think there's a more important role for NATO. After everything that the Trump administration did to demean NATO rhetorically, the Biden administration is committed to rebuilding alliances, and I think will be more open, will have its ears open to NATO European views on INF and on other issues. So it's no time for European NATO members to be quiet, rather to engage the US as well as Russia on the priorities for European security.
Anyone else? GAUKHAR, you want to come in here?
I think I'll come in on the questions about the role of civil society and next generation, which are linked, and their role in terms of supporting nuclear risk reduction and other efforts towards nuclear disarmament. I think, as ever, the first point is to be informed. Is to be informed of the policies and issues, and to raise them in whatever format possible to deprive the politicians and decision makers of the excuse that this is not a very big public issue, that they can just decide whatever they decide without any public pressure. And the role of the new treaty banning nuclear weapons is particularly important in this regard. I think it has a potential to move, especially the next generation in Europe. And so raise those questions. Ask governments what are our positions on nuclear weapons. If we have nuclear weapons, what is our position on using them? How we are making sure we don't escalate to a nuclear war? If we are US allies, what is our position on American policy on the use of nuclear weapons? Are they claiming they would use nuclear weapons on our behalf? How do we feel about that? So it's and I think I saw a question having to do with nuclear posture review. I think as the Biden administration is going to work on the next nuclear posture review, the views of allies on the question of no first use, for example, will be very important, as they were during the work on Obama's nuclear posture review, when the administration seriously considered going to sole purpose, and it was actually the allies, some of the U.S. allies, that expressed serious concerns about going there. So the role of allies will be important in this regard as well. If civil society in those respective countries, Japan, for example, insist on policies that are closer to no first use rather than promises to use nuclear weapons on behalf of Japan, then that would be, I think, would be helpful for pushing for greater nuclear risk reduction measures and sole purpose in the United States. And for the organizations like IPPNW, the additional ways and responsibilities is to use their professional knowledge and work on studies about the impact, for example, of nuclear weapons, and promoting that information, giving that information to decision makers, parliamentarians, and broader audience about what it actually entails to have nuclear weapons and to use nuclear weapons.
Thank you very much, Gaukhar. Yes, Anton, please go ahead.
I just would like to build on what just Gaukhar said with regard the role of civil society. One of the final Gaukhar point was, to work with the governments on what, and by the way, legislators as well, what is the impact of nuclear weapon, but I would add nuclear weapon tests on the population. And here, again, I would like to return to the CTBT. Again, it is quite unfortunate that there are not many think tanks, civil society groups, which work on CTBT-related issues on a regular basis. We remember well how well structured and organized was the work of civil society think tankers during the nuclear security summit cycles. And I think it contributed a lot. It was the role those think tanks and personalities play was really, really important. And I hope to see a similar contribution in particular on CTBT. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, there is no single think tank in the States nowadays, as well as, by the way, in other countries which have not yet signed or ratified the treaty, which work on those issues on everyday basis, probably except Arms Control Association, because Daryl Kimball is so much committed to this particular issue. But that's it. If we are serious about progress, this is not how it should how we should progress. I mean, we do need work on this issue on a regular basis.
Thank you, Anton, for mentioning Daryl Kimball, because if you hadn't, I would have done it. But I also want to tell you that there is an effort underway within the group of eminent persons of the CTBTO. And this was really, there was funds that were raised, and, you know, it's always coming down to a matter of someone probably has to pay for some of it. And that is done by Des Brown, who has raised some funds, and there will be a unit established at Oxford University to actually do academic research and also some outreach in that point. It's been a little delayed because of the coronavirus situation, the pandemic situation, but it is something that is already a package that just needs to be signed off by a number of people, and then we can start. So that is something I think we all welcome very much. But I agree with you that civil society is an important factor, and we haven't heard very much from them in that area. I think the Federation of American Scientists has a coalition on the CTBT, but you know, that's something that one doesn't always hear that much about. Now, I do have a large number of other areas, but I wanted to, because you've mentioned the JCPOA a couple of times, let me also mention that the IRP is going to have a meeting on the JCPOA, a panel discussion, and the nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, middle of next month. I think it's the 15th. So if you're interested in that, then do please register. I think it'll be very, very interesting. And then I also had a question from Alan Ware, and that is, could Mr. Countryman, Mr. KHLOPKOV comment on the possibilities to achieve no first use or sole purpose policies by USA and Russia? And for USA, would agreement from NATO, Japan, and South Korea be necessary? And what can actually legislators do to promote this? This is what he asked. So let me turn this over to you.
Okay. Well, no first use is an important issue to talk about. In the final days of the Obama administration, Vice President Biden stated clearly his view that the sole purpose of a nuclear arsenal is to deter others from using nuclear weapons. Now, the question that we face is whether President Biden is prepared to put that belief expressed 4 years ago into immediate practice. There are reasons against doing it, which include the fact that he has 100 more urgent things to do. It includes the fact that of those 100 more urgent things, 97 of them are going to be bitterly opposed by the other party in Congress, and he needs to pick his battles to a certain extent. And then there is also the U.S. practice of the last several administrations of first doing an exhaustive bureaucratic study called the Nuclear Posture Review before making any changes in nuclear doctrine or structure. There's a good reason for that. You want to sustain as much as possible a national consensus, a bipartisan consensus on something as big and expensive as nuclear weapons policy, but it also slows things down. If that takes a year, and in most presidential administrations, whatever you don't get done in the first year does not get done in the next 3 years, there's a disadvantage to doing that. I would hope to see instead that the U.S., that the Biden administration, rather than waiting either for a comprehensive nuclear posture review or for the early outcome of strategic discussions with Moscow, simply acts on what President Biden has already said is a sensible policy, a sensible doctrine for the United States, and then directs both the nuclear posture review and the enormously expensive nuclear weapons budget, over $50 billion a year, in that direction. There is one important downside that's referred to in the question, and that is it has to be done in a way that reassures allies that the U.S. unwillingness to use nuclear weapons first in no way diminishes the security guarantees that we have given to certain allies in Europe and Asia. That will be tricky. Of course, it will make people nervous, but I believe it can be done. Last point about no first use. A declaration of such a policy does not immediately make itself credible. What makes it credible is if other steps are taken in terms of arsenal, doctrine, and posture that gives credibility to that declaration. I still believe that such a declaration by the Biden administration could be a huge confidence-building measure, in fact, a game changer in both bilateral and multilateral negotiations.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for that answer. Actually, the same question came in also from Heinz Gärtner. I had just not seen it because there were so many questions I couldn't scroll through all of them. So that clearly was in the minds of a number of the people who were watching this. I can go to the next question, and we're not going to have time for all of them, so maybe we can just go to the last one. And this comes from Hiroaki Nakanishi, who had actually several questions asked, and this one really talks about the lack of experience involved in nuclear arms control measures for China, the UK, and France, and how can the US and Russia socialize them, he says, for arms control culture. Specifically, can the US and Russia invite them for sharing data under the New START Treaty or before mentioned ban on nuclear-armed intermediate-range ballistic and cruise missile with a credible verification? And also, can the US and Russia and China, the UK and France agree on the declaration of the sole purpose nuclear deterrence to reduce the role of nuclear weapons? There are a number of questions all in that realm. So let me ask you, because we only have 5 minutes left, if anyone wants to pick that up.
Well, there's three questions there. The answers are yes, maybe, and yes.
Okay. Any concluding remarks then from any of you? Let me stop there.
I think GAUKHAR had a better answer than I did to Hiroki's question.
Perhaps a little wordier answer, but on the question of inviting reporting, there is actually a form for that, more or less, because under the 2010 NPT action plan, the 5 nuclear weapon states committed to develop a common reporting form on issues relevant to their nuclear weapon arsenals. So far, they had come up with just sort of general headings that each of them interpreted very broadly how they're going to fill it in. But one way to advance this is, of course, to agree to report more specifically on the kinds of nuclear weapons in their arsenals. And there is a repository on the website of the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs that is meant to receive exactly that kind of information. So the format is there, the obligation is there. The countries just need to agree more specifically what they're going to report. I'll stop there.
Thank you for bringing that up, Gaukhar. I remember that when I was in the function of High Representative, I had reminded member states of that because it's 10 years old now and there's very little information that was ever supplied. So that is one of the aspects. Yeah, can I invite you to have any final comments? If not, I can ask one more question, and that goes specifically to both Tom and Anton. It comes from a colleague at the OSCE and is asking, how can we improve military-to-military contacts? Important question. You've raised these issues before. Any thoughts on that, Tom?
Yeah, couple of points. In reducing the risk of nuclear war, you want to make sure there's no incentive for a first strike. And even after the last 4 years of unhinged government in Washington, I believe there's never been a leader in Washington or Moscow who seriously contemplated national suicide by planning a first strike. You want to have nuclear structures, arsenals, doctrines that prevent escalation from a conventional war to a nuclear war. And that is one of the topics of a strategic stability dialogue. But you also need to reduce the risk of conventional confrontation, particularly between Russia and NATO. And to that end, there was an excellent Track 2 dialogue over the last year that resulted in a set of recommendations. It's published on the Iskran website in Russia that lays out a number of steps that that NATO and Russia can do to get back to regular mill dialogue, despite all of our political problems today, despite not being able to get back fully to business as usual, very specific measures that can reduce the risk of conflict and the risk of escalation of an accident in Europe. And part of that is regular mill dialogue. I believe that there is support, as I said, both in the administration and in Congress for that kind of professional dialogue between our militaries. So I'm optimistic that it's going to happen and gradually get to a real problem-solving, risk-reducing, maybe not confidence-building, but certainly risk-reducing way to go.
Thank you very much, Tom. Yes, Anton.
A very quick response to the last question. As I mentioned in my introductory remarks, I do believe it's really important. I do believe we need regular mill-to-mill contacts in addition to the negotiations or dialogue between the diplomats. And despite, by the way, the tense relations during the recent years, we do have a regular mill-to-mill exchanges on Syria-related issues. And I think we can build on that, and political will is needed. And I agree with what just Tom said, what could be the agenda for those discussions. I mean, the nuclear doctrines. There are so many misinterpretations what actually Russia's or US doctrines says or not said. So those regular contacts will help a lot to prevent an accident because of miscommunication or misreading what a doctrine or a document of other countries says.
Thank you very much, Anton. I think that we should conclude here, and it was really, I wanted to thank you very much for spending the time with us and sharing your expertise. It was just an excellent session, I thought, and very informative. And you all covered a very comprehensive set, not only New Start, but also the whole gamut of, how we're going to go forward and what can be done and what have we learned from the past. So I think we had so many questions. I'm sorry, and I apologize to those who asked more questions that we weren't able to get to all of them. But we promised 90 minutes, and 90 minutes it is. And we hope to see you at another time, at another seminar, which I'm sure we will. And again, Tom, happy President's Day. We are joyfully celebrating this President's Day, which we didn't in the last years. So there we go. So thank you very much, and goodbye to all of you. And thank you, participants, for being here with us and asking excellent questions. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.